So was the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament written in the Bronze Age? And do we have any original manuscripts of it anymore? Answers to those questions are coming up on Bible Freakout.
No matter what you read or what you hear, there is no need to freak out.
Welcome to Bible Freakout. I'm Dr. Bruce Wells from the University of Texas at Austin. This is the show where we look at how other people might be freaking out about something they've heard or read about the Bible, and we offer context and information to explain why they don't need to do that. Today I want to talk about an article that was in the New York Times recently that explained that the Secretary of Education in the state of Oklahoma has called for the public schools in that state to, quote, teach the Bible, unquote. Of course, a lot of readers wrote in and were upset about this. They questioned the constitutionality of this idea and whether or not it would stand up in the courts. But a number of readers expressed objections to the value of the Bible itself. So I'm going to look at some of those objections and try to explain why I think they might be freaking out too much, and there's other information that they can take into account that would allow them to make a different conclusion. So the first comment, actually it was a couple of comments, alluded to this idea that the Bible comes from the Bronze Age, and people in the Bronze Age told wild stories that aren't really of value to us anymore. Now, as other people have pointed out, what we call the Hebrew Bible, or in Jewish tradition the Tanakh, or in Christian tradition the Old Testament, is really a product of the Iron Age and the period after that, the Persian period, and not really so much of the Bronze Age. Now, I don't know if that would actually satisfy the people who make this objection. They might say, well, Bronze Age, Iron Age, it doesn't really make any difference. Both time periods are from a really long time ago. We live in a much more modern society now. We have a lot more information than they did back then. Why should we listen to any ideas from those time periods? Well, there are a lot of remarkable developments that took place in the Bronze Age. For example, at the beginning of the Bronze Age, we have the invention of writing. Early writing started out in a pictographic system where each sign or symbol stood for a particular word or concept. Eventually, it developed into a system combining signs that stood for syllables with some of these pictograms. And then in the Middle Bronze Age, we have the earliest evidence for the development of the alphabet. Now, every alphabet that's been used across the world can actually be traced back to this first alphabet that was invented in the Middle East in the Middle Bronze Age. When you get to the Iron Age, the alphabet basically takes over. The Aramaic language, which was written in an alphabet-based script, became the lingua franca of that time period. Not only do we have the invention of writing and the invention of the alphabet, there's also basically the invention of law or a legal system. The earliest legal documents that we have in the world, basically, come from the Middle East from around 2600 or 2700 BCE. They have to do with sales of real estate. And by the time we get these, it appears that there is a fairly well-developed legal system in place to accommodate business transactions, other types of agreements, such as marriages, trials and litigation and so forth, already in place. There's also the development of the 12-month calendar. That was first developed in the Bronze Age in the Middle East. The point is, there are a lot of good ideas that come from these older time periods that we still use today, we still rely on, and they shouldn't just be rejected quite so quickly. Well, how do we know that the Hebrew Bible comes from the Iron Age and the period right after that, the Persian period? What we call the Hebrew Bible is essentially a product of the nation-state of Judah. Now, Judah was formed after the split in what we call the United Kingdom. So let's say probably in the 10th century you have the United Kingdom under David and Solomon. There's some debate about that, but let's go with it for now. And at the end of Solomon's reign, sometime around 900 BCE, give or take a decade or two, there seems to have been a brief civil war, and there's a split in the nation. The north secedes from the south. So the tribes in the north have their own nation state, which is still called Israel. And then in the south, those few southern tribes there have their own nation state that we call Judah. And the biblical texts, as far as we can tell, primarily come from Judah. The Hebrew language that we have in the biblical texts seems like the dialect of Hebrew that was spoken in the south in Judah. And Judah is an Iron Age nation state. And some of the texts come from a much later time period. Books like Chronicles and Esther and Ecclesiastes and Ezra and Nehemiah will come after the end of the Bronze Age and well into the Persian period, and even some of those texts probably come from the Greek period. The second issue that was raised by readers who wrote in to comment on the article in the Times has to do with the fact that we don't have any original manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible anymore. They said, how do you know what it said if you don't have any original manuscripts? But this is a problem for nearly all of ancient literature. So if you're thinking about stories and texts from Homer or Plato or Aristotle or Plutarch or Cicero or Virgil and on, the fact is we don't have original manuscripts of any of those authors. Even if you fast forward quite a ways into the 1500s, late 1500s in the time of Shakespeare, we don't have any original manuscripts of Shakespeare either. The earliest manuscript we have of any scrap of Shakespeare's plays comes shortly after his death and was written out by someone else who was adapting some of Shakespeare's plays and left out a lot of what Shakespeare probably originally wrote. He severely edited it and created his own manuscript. So this is a problem we know about, and when new English translations are made today, people go back to the same manuscripts that are available to us. These are manuscripts that are in Hebrew, because most of the Hebrew Bible was written in Hebrew, but some of them are in Aramaic, since parts of the Hebrew Bible we think were originally written in Aramaic. The manuscripts that they go back to come either from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which take us back to around 150 BCE, 100 BCE, in that time period, or from later time periods during the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, 700, 800, 900 CE, in that time range. No one's hiding any manuscripts. We think that the manuscripts we have are copies, probably of copies that at some point were made of the quote-unquote original texts. But there's a whole discipline called textual criticism that seeks to analyze the differences among the manuscripts that we have and try to decide what might have been in the quote-unquote original text. So in the next few episodes, we'll look at more reader comments to this New York Times article and their particular objections to the value of the Bible. And remember, no matter what you read or what you hear, there is no need to freak out.